Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Product. So tonight, I'm super excited to talk to Phyllis Njoroge. She's a product manager at Redfin. Hey, Phyllis, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, super excited to have you here. So the show, real quick, breaking into product management was tough for me, and I never could find, I couldn't really find a good resource or good answers around a few questions. So I'm hoping I can just ask you the questions tonight, and then you can we'll build out a resource for everyone else. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Awesome. Do you want to do a quick introduction for yourself before we get started?
Sure. So, as mentioned, Phyllis Njoroge, product manager at Redfin. I started in August of 2020. So, I've been a product manager for about 6 months and I'm a recent grad. So, product manager, pretty straight out of school.
Awesome. So now that you've been in product for about 6 months, how would you define product management?
I personally would define product management as the act, the art and science combined, the act of bringing together all the relevant parties to make a product successful. And the definition of success being what is the most important thing to solve a customer's problem. So it's bringing together all the relevant parties to successfully implement a solution to a customer's problem and successfully implement the most important solution to a customer's problem because there's always so many problems to solve.
Man, ain't that the truth? So let's maybe I kind of want to dive down that path a little bit because a lot of people don't talk about that, how the products just the problems just evolve. And as you get in and build the products, I think that you the stakeholders bring more problems and more solutions that are needed to be delivered. How do you kind of manage the problems as a product manager?
I would say in this case, it's kind of frequency, volume, and impact, uh, qualitative impact. So frequency and volume are more quantitative measures versus qualitative impact. So for example, frequency is how often it occurs for a certain set of people, and then volume being how large is that set of people. And then qualitative impact is it might be a really small problem and it might not come up that frequently, but when it comes up, it's a huge problem. So, for example, like the difference between forgetting your mask at home versus someone using like let's say you have an app, right, that's supposed to remind you to take your mask whenever you leave the house. So that's like one product that's solving a problem, but that could be very frequent, but the like problem that it's solving is not super deep in terms of qualitative impact versus you might have a hospital machine and that's your product that's being used right now to like save people's lives who actually have COVID. And then, so ideally, the frequency of that is not as frequent, but the qualitative impact of that product and the problem that it's solving is huge. So it's kind of, those are the three ways that I kind of think about a problem and then think about prioritizing with respect to those categories.
That's awesome. That's a phenomenal response. I love what you said there. Um, so you said you got into product management right out of school. One, what did that look like? Like, what'd you go to school for? And at what point did you say, I want to be a product manager?
So the way I describe product management is that I always wanted to be a product manager. I just didn't know what the title was. And so the longer story is I was into art as a kid, and then I was also super into the human mind. And I grew up wanting to be a neurosurgeon, and I wanted to be a neurosurgeon up until about sophomore year of college. So this entire time, I'm like super interested in psychology and neuroscience and cognition and like how humans operate and think and interact with the world. And then my senior year of college, so I was a cognitive and brain sciences major, by the way. So my senior year of college, I decided to look into UX design as a way to combine my love of art with my love of the brain and people. And in that, I kind of felt like some part of that experience was lacking because I creating these mock-ups and like thinking about the user experience, but I don't understand the technical implementation. So the next step there was to start to teach myself how to code so I could actually have the full experience of what I now know is called the product. And so in this case, I started teaching myself how to code, and then I went to a software engineering boot camp after that. And during the boot camp, so the total story is on my way home from doing my homework at some point, my Lyft driver had asked me, "So what do you want to do when you graduate?" Like classic question. And when he asked me this, I was like, "Well, I want to get a job." And he's like, "Okay, but what job?" And then he really like probed me for what exactly I was looking for. And I told him UX developer in quotation marks. I was making up a title because I didn't want to be a software engineer and I didn't want to be a UX designer, but I wanted to care about the user experience and the technical implementation and the business impact. So then at this point, I was left with this challenge getting out of this Lyft ride with what actually am I trying to do when I graduate? So I started talking to people on LinkedIn and I asked them, "Hey, this is the kind of role that I'm looking for. Can you help me find it?" And after asking several people, I was blessed with the same conclusion over and over again, which is, I think you're looking for product management. So that's kind of how I found out about product management. And then from there, once I knew that that's the title I've been going for this entire time, I just like doubled down on trying to get into the role.
That's an incredible story. So thanks for that Lyft driver. That's awesome. Um, you know what? I always ask everyone. It always comes up. Um, how technical do product managers need to be? And I have that conversation. And would love to have that with you also. But I don't talk a lot about. I don't hear PMs actually talk a lot about UX design. Can you like for someone listening to this that might be interested in product manager management or an aspiring PM, can you talk a little bit about UX design and how its role in the day to day of a product manager?
Yeah, so I would say your UX design is kind of everything, honestly. And I'm sure people would have very differing views on that when it comes to the product. But at the end of the day, when you think about things like product led growth, like what is the product that someone is interacting with? They're interacting with the interface, interacting with the design of the experience and the user interface. And so then that becomes the make or break point. Like people leave because the experience is not intuitive and they don't understand how to use it, or people leave because or and find another product because it's prettier or it's flashier, it has like more delight, as you would put it. So you can have like the best tech in the world and like on the back end like be building the most incredible thing, but then on the front end, like if you have like a crazy skeleton of a website, people aren't going to use your product. So it becomes such a critical part, and I think sometimes companies can underinvest because they like want the really good tech and like maybe they want to get really good salespeople who just like really push out getting people onboarded. But the way that you keep people is by having a good user experience and like showing that you actually care about your user in the product itself. And I think that's kind of the foundation of where this whole product led growth idea is coming from. It's from the UX design.
That's awesome. So I kind of have to ask selfishly for myself. I'm new. I've recently kind of dove into design and downloaded Figma and have been building mockups in Figma. I was using Keynote just to build the mockups, but I'd love to hear like what some tips are for product managers who want to dive deeper into UX.
Yeah, I would say definitely start by realizing that you're probably not that good of a designer. Even as someone who literally graduated college with an offer to become a UX designer and I turned down the offer, I know that I'm not a great designer compared to the other designers that we have at my company. And my job is to focus on being a product manager, not trying to think that I'm the best designer as well. And I think that that can be a blind spot because everyone's like, oh, well, I have eyes. I can see what's pretty. I can see what looks nice. But that's not what UX design is. It's kind of like when I hear people think like, well, I'm good at asking questions. So obviously I know user research, like completely disregarding the fact that people get entire PhDs in like structuring research. So I think it's really important to realize like design is its own field and it requires its own high level of mastery. And a lot of it goes into it besides just like picking colors and like pushing pixels, as my design partner likes to call it. It's really thinking about the whole experience and thinking about design trends, right? Like thinking about the industry and what trends there are in the industry, thinking about how those are relevant to your specific niche or part of the tech industry, as well as thinking about the psychology behind it. There's a lot of research that actually goes into user experience design. It's not just a visual, like, oh, well, that kind of looks nice. And I think sometimes people can be like, well, I can see whether a box looks nice or not, and then underestimate like how much skill and prowess it actually really takes to be really good at UX design. So 100% definitely appreciate anyone who's trying to understand design better, because it helps if you have those skills, but just understand that like as a product manager, you're not also going to become like the world's best UX designer and the world's best software engineer. And I feel like sometimes PMs fail themselves by like thinking that they can do all of those things to like an exceptional level of mastery, rather than being good at aligning those said partners, the design partner, the engineering partner, to make the product successful, and like leveraging the people who actually do have that high level of mastery.
Wow, that's an incredible response, because that's exactly where I was like 2 months ago. Just 2 months ago, it was like, oh, I have eyes. Oh, I know what websites I like. Oh, I know what colors. Uh, Blue means trust, so I think we'll use blue. Like, um, that was me. And so then diving into the design with one of our UX designers, I'm just like mind blown at the level of just pixel perfect detail and the intent that goes into every piece of the design. So yeah, no, thank you for that. And then full stack developer, like how did that help you how did that help you as a PM?
I would say, so I'm kind of blessed with the fact that Redfin doesn't hire people for technical ability, even though I have the technical background, because I've been able to, I would say, have a more unbiased view of what technical aptitude actually means, because I wasn't like put through this process that made me believe that I needed it. So because I didn't come into this convinced that I needed it, I think my eye was more open to seeing the ways in which I actually might not, but also being realistic about the ways in which I do. So I'd say first and foremost, I'd say confidence, right? Because I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there of people saying like, oh, well, you have to be technical to be a PM, and like, oh, like you don't have a computer science degree, like how does it feel to be like a non-major PM? And I always get confused when I hear that, because there isn't a product management major, so I'm not exactly sure what major people are referring to. But I would say just having the confidence to be like, well, I have my background in design, I have my background in engineering, and like that allowed me to feel better about trying to become a product manager, so that like people's commentary about what I needed to get together or what I don't have didn't bring me down because it wasn't as relevant. So I'd say that's the first like way that I can think of off the top of my head it helped the most. But also in terms of what I just said, like you're not the engineer. You should leverage your engineers who are really good at their job. But it helps to communicate with these people in a way that it's like, I know what you're saying, and you don't have to break it down for me. Like it saves time in terms of the conversation, but it's also just like people have a bias towards people like themselves. And I would not be surprised if engineers have a bias towards PMs that understand engineering. They're like, oh, I like this person. Like, I love our conversations. And I'm sure that that influences the relationship and makes it better. So it helps with the communication. Again, don't really think it's required, but I think human bias in this process makes it helpful. And then lastly, I'd say the ways in which it might actually be somewhat required, because I don't expect PMs to be coding. If you're at a company where that's the case, I'd say this is a different conversation. But if you're a company like mine, where we have our engineers and their job is engineering and my job is the product management, and those are separate, I would say it helps to like kind of call BS on engineers if you have an engineering background yourself, because an engineer will be like, well, I can't do this because it's too hard. I'm like, okay, so explain why it's too hard. And then they'll actually talk about the implementation. I'm like, but that's possible. Like, I know how to do that. So I know you know how to do that. So I think that that's how I've seen it play out, where like actually having the technical knowledge was like necessary for a negotiation that I was having in terms of talking about the way we were planning out the development for a project. But other than that, I haven't seen it be super critical. I've just seen it be helpful. And I would say a lot of people are inflating helpful with critical. And something that one of my coworkers said to me that I really appreciate is like, just because something's hard doesn't mean you can't do it. So just because it's harder to be a PM without like a extensive technical background while you're working with very technical products, it does not mean it's impossible, and that shouldn't discourage you from trying just because you don't have that background.
Wow, that's such a perfect response. Um, so just thinking back to like your first couple months in product, what kind of advice would you give other PMs, maybe a new PM? What kind of advice would you provide them with starting off their new role as a product manager?
I would primarily say that I want people to really understand if they actually want to be a product manager. I think some level of exercising self awareness and self assessment in terms of what you're actually looking for is important, because I think I'm starting to see, as it gets trendier and trendier, for people to kind of get caught up in things about the role that aren't actually the role. They're like, oh, well, I want to work at Google and I can't be an engineer, so let me try for product management. Or they're like, well, I heard product managers get paid a lot. Or like, oh, it's the CEO of the product. Like, I want to be a CEO. Like, just a lot of things that aren't actually the truth of being a product manager that end up appealing to people. And then I realized that they might not actually want to be a product manager as much as they think they do. So, like I said earlier, I got into product because I wanted the product's role, and I found out later that product management was the title for the role that I was looking for. So, it was not a thing of I heard the title and I convinced myself that I wanted to be a PM, whereas I'm seeing a lot of people hear about PM and convince themselves that they want it. So I'd say exercising self-awareness and what do you really want out of a role and what do you want your work to look like, and are you okay with the realities of being a product manager? Not like the cute PR of being a product manager, but the actual serious realities, such as like having to get things done, but having no authority to do so. Like that's really hard, especially if you really, really need things done and you're nobody's boss. So, the CEO product thing becomes just falls to the ground because it's not the reality of how it plays out. Or thinking about things that like, well, it pays super well. A lot of companies might hire you to be a PM for no pay. They'll like tell you, we'll pay you once we get funding as we grow as a startup. Or they, as a smaller startup, they might pay you, but not as much as Amazon is, for example. And if you're caught up in thinking about the prettiness of the role instead of the realities of like maybe you have to work really long hours, especially if you're at a startup, or if your time is required all the time to be putting out fires and all of these other things. So what I did when I got into product is that the second I decided that this was the role I wanted, I found out everything terrible about it. I kind of think of it's kind of like dating. I don't know, maybe other people don't do this, but I'm kind of like, let's save both of us time here. Let me find out all the things about you that I might not like down the road so that I don't have to like go down this path if it's not the right path. And I kind of did the same thing with product where I like asked everyone, I was like, if you had a magic wand, what would you change? What's the hardest thing about your day to day? Like, what do you struggle with the most? Like, what's the most challenging part of your job? Like, would you choose another job if you could? What are the things about products that people don't really think about until they're actually in the weeds of the role? I asked so many people these questions instead of asking them, like, what do you like about your job? Or like, what's the best thing about your company? Because that just continues to bias you towards thinking, this is perfect. Like, I love this. But I heard about the challenges and I was like, those are challenges that I want. Like, these are things that I want. Again, back to like the dating analogy. It's like, oh, like, well, you're going to be my forever person because the things that I don't like about you are things that I'm still willing to put up with because I love the rest of this more, versus deciding like you're not going to date someone because actually like it's just not a fit and the bad things are not going to work. So I'd say I wish people did more investigating as to whether they really want this role and not just getting caught up in trying to be a PM because they want to try and be a PM because everyone's trying to be a PM.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I actually have a blog post saved right now. It's not that easy, and it's like everybody. I think we hear the founders get on probably Clubhouse and LinkedIn and all these other places talking about product managers lead to starting your lead to startups, lead to being the CEO of a startup. And I think people hear that and it's like, okay, that sounds cool. I want to do that. But I think the day to day, people need to just be realistic and understand the challenges, the the extreme level and requirement of leading through influence and um, coming up with features that you spend a ton of time on that might not get approved, and having those conversations. So a lot of great nuggets there. And I love your piece about kind of like working backward. And as I think about it, I think a lot of people look for careers like this and they say, I want to do that. What do I need to do that? Right? Not about, I want to do this and what role is right for me to do this. And I think that people would find a lot more fulfillment in their roles if they started with what they love doing and then finding a role that fits them and not trying to mold themselves to fit the role, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and then I also, so speaking of that, I saw you have an awesome blog also on Medium, and I saw a post around minimal viable version of yourself. Can you talk about that? Like, what do you mean by that?
Oh, yes. Oh, wow. It's been a while since I wrote that post. Oh, Lord. Yeah, I think for a period of time, I was like so deep in the job search for PM that I was thinking about everything as a product, basically. And in that case, with that blog post, it's kind of what I was talking about is what is the threshold of your life that you're kind of satisfied with, because I think people are eternally striving for more and like are in a continuous state of dissatisfaction that can kind of be a little unhealthy, and they're always like striving for other people, like it's a grass is always greener on the other side thing, so then you just start circling the earth looking for another yard, and I don't think that's healthy behavior. So when I think about the MVP, like the minimum viable version of my life, it's like these are the things that I think are necessary to make me happy, to make me fulfilled. Like this is my criteria for success, and once I've reached this I will be satisfied, versus living a life where it's like you're constantly raising your own bar. And it's not that I think those things are mutually exclusive. I think it's more about like learning to be satisfied with what you've produced in your life without giving yourself anxiety about what you haven't, because a lot of people get caught up in things without realizing that they don't actually want those things. So for example, I saw a tweet the other day that someone was like, why do you actually want $1 million, right? Like I think a lot of people are like, I want to be a millionaire, but then no one has like, if I walk up to random people and I'm like, hey, can you give me like a budgeted action plan if I were to give you $1 million right now? They don't have it. Like they in concept want it, and then they're upset that they don't have it, and then they continue to strive, and then they're definitely going to get to 1 million and be like, well, I need 10 million now, right? Like you're always reaching for something else, versus like when I think about the MVP version of life, it's like I literally calculated this for myself actually when I was in my junior year, I think, of college. I calculated how much money it would actually take for me to be satisfied with my life. And the amount ended up being like 98,000, some's a very specific digit, based off of a lot of factors. And then I was like, cool. When I reach this amount of money in life, I will be satisfied and I'm not going to keep comparing myself to other people. And I do that with other things in my life as well, where it's like, yes, I can always be prettier, I can always be skinnier, I can always be healthier, faster, smarter, more anything. But what's the criteria that I'm saying, like, this is what I'm going to be satisfied with, so that I'm not constantly in a state of anxiety. And then at the same time, like, still pushing myself for more while knowing that I am content with what I actually have.
That's incredible. That's so true. And it, from a product management standpoint, I mean, it just makes me think about, I'm sure you see it also, is like on social media, it's always about how to be a product manager at Facebook or how to be a product manager at Amazon or at Google. And it's like, why do you really want to be a PM at Google or at Amazon or like, why those specific companies? Like what? And I think that it's the grass. There's always this grass is greener on the other side, or you have to get to this level where you could be a kick-ass PM at a at a shoe store, right? And that's I'm at a JD Finish Line, and or you could be a kick-ass PM at Redfin, right? And which is no small company. But have you seen that trend also?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it kind of ties into product. I hate to say this, but it really ties into product where it's like what are your success metrics? Like what is actual definition of success and why? And like when you think about like when you do a PM interview, you have to tie success metrics to your user problem. Like you can't just make them up and be like, we want a high view count. And it's like, well, that's not relevant to the user problem. And surprisingly, actually, lower views would correspond with you actually solving the user problem. So I think about it similarly in life where like people are like, well, I want to work at Google. And it's like, for what? Like, what exactly are you trying to get out of that? And for me specifically, like, if I love Redfin, I have no plans to leave. But if I were to go anywhere, I think I might be interested in Google, not because it's just called Google, but because I think about the culture there and in terms of like the product itself and like actually talking to people who work at that company, I've determined that I want to work there versus when I was interviewing for Redfin, I literally like pulled out of the interview process for Amazon, even though I had a referral. And for context, like this was not a referral that I asked for. Like I got an email from Amazon saying like someone at their company wanted me to interview with them. And I was like, no, I'm sorry. And the thing is that if I were the type of person to say, well, I want to work at a brand name company, then that's something that I would have gone for. But I know myself and I know what my actual criteria are for the things that I'm looking for and why. And I knew that Amazon wasn't going to fit into that plan. So I think it's really important for people to know, like, what do you actually want out of this? Especially because I see this all the time. People will get the thing and then they'll be unhappy and they don't know why they're unhappy because they never defined why that thing was going to make them happy, but they assumed it would, and they only reflect on that after the fact. So I really encourage people to think about that before the fact instead.
That's awesome. What about book recommendations? Do you have any favorite books? I know you just interviewed Marty Kagan on Clubhouse. That was an incredible session. But what books do you recommend?
Yeah, so is this specific to product or just in life?
Anything, whatever books you think would help a PM, and it doesn't have to be a product management book.
Oh, okay, that's fair.
You can interview.
So one of the first books that I read in terms of like my job process was Never Split the Difference, which is a negotiation book by Chris Voss. And I think that's helpful because like I said, product managers, you're leading with no authority, which means basically everything you do is a negotiation. So I think having some grasp on communication and negotiation tactics is super helpful. So I'd highly suggest that book for that aspect of things. And then, yeah, just for a general understanding of product and product teams, Inspired by Marty Kagan is great. Empowered is more for product leaders and managers, like managers of the managers, not product managers. And Lean Product Playbook by Dan Olson are also that with Inspired. Those are both really great for just like general understanding of products baseline. And then in terms of other things that I think about, so for example, if we're talking about design, so from a design standpoint, Don't Make Me Think is helpful for user experience design. I would also say in terms of like user research, the MOM test is helpful in terms of how you conduct user research and think about how people interact with your product. And then from an engineering standpoint, I would not tell anyone to read books on how to code. So I can't say that I have a suggestion for that. But from a sales standpoint, I don't know how to say his name properly, but I currently have Founding Sales by Peter Kaczynski. I'm so sorry. Kazanji, I'm messing that one up. But in terms of sales for PM, I would say that that's a good book. And I think that covers all the categories, unless I'm forgetting a category of book. In terms of personal finance, because you're going to have a job as a PM and you should probably know how to manage your finances no matter how much you're getting paid. Definitely suggest I Will Teach You to Be Rich by Ramit Sethi and also The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel.
Wow, that's an amazing list. I'm going to immediately check out Don't Make Me Think and the Mom Test. Um, what question didn't I ask? Did I anything else you want to talk about?
That's actually a really great question. What question didn't I ask? I think I'm going to start stealing that one. I would say you definitely covered a lot of things. I was also highly impressed by the fact that you like went through my Medium because I completely forgot about that article, to be honest. But yeah, I would say that that's like a pretty solid overview of things. Um, I guess another question is, as a new PM, right? Onboarding in a pandemic and also just like onboarding to a new company. Question that I would ask myself is like, what would I say to myself slash what has been helpful in the past couple of months? And my answer to that is just ask a lot of questions. Ask a lot of questions. I used to get so annoyed when people would tell me this because I'm like, it has to be more convoluted than that. Like that can't possibly be the answer, but surprisingly simple things are the answer. And I've found it in my experience, asking a lot of questions actually ends up being the greatest strength in terms of onboarding and building a really good product, right? Whether that comes from the design or the research or just communicating with people, asking a lot of questions is so critical. And I think the greatest way to fail yourself is to be afraid of asking a stupid question. Because I've found, especially with product, the stupid question ends up being the most insightful because something that seems so basic and upfront actually reveals assumptions that were critical to address that you wouldn't have addressed otherwise. And that becomes such a big part of the product process. So that, as well as just taking a lot of notes, you're going to get a lot of information, you're going to get a lot of answers. And I think having a lot of notes to refer to, because one, documenting things for my future reference, for other people's reference as well. And also just when other people ask you questions, I think onboarding's hard. And as you learn a bunch of things, it's nice to build documentation to help the next person not have to ask as many questions. So something that I found to be super helpful is kind of like pay it forward by taking a lot of notes.
That's awesome. Any suggestions on how to take notes? Because I couldn't agree more. Especially and newer to my role when I first started. You kind of just get pointed to the Confluence pages or the Google Drive and this and that. But um, I'm totally with paying it forward. What advice would you give like for the note taking process?
Yeah, so for me, so similar to what I said about don't be afraid to ask stupid questions because it'll reveal assumptions that you're missing. Something that I found is super helpful is like, don't be afraid to take all of the notes, even for something you're like, oh, I don't need to note that down because I know it. Surprisingly, you end up needing to know specifically that thing that you said you didn't need to note down. So I found like almost like borderline transcription note taking to be super helpful. And then coming back to reorganize it. I think just from what I learned in college for studying, right? It's like you take your notes in class and then you rewrite them to be better. And like obviously PMs don't have time to be out here rewriting notes, but just like having a more condensed version of things after you like skim something has been super helpful because when I take a bunch of notes, I'm not just gonna hand over that whole sheet of notes to someone else, right? Like they want the briefer version or the more nugget filled version instead of the whole story. So I'll just like look through it briefly, take like a bullet or numbered list of the things that are important, and then pass that off to someone else, either in an email, Slack message, etc., or like build documentation in Google Docs, etc. So I'd say like borderline transcription so that you're not missing anything important.
That's awesome. And I love how much you talked about the questions. One book that I read a couple years ago, is The Coaching Habit. It's The Coaching Habit. Say less and ask more and change the way you lead. And it just talks about these 7 essential questions. The first one of which is what's on your mind, and then you essentially literally just keep asking, and what else, and what else, and what else until like it runs out. And you really, when you talk about leading through influence, a lot of that comes down to really a lot of our job comes back to like serving the dev team, right? And making sure that that we're one getting the acceptance criteria right, and helping them overcome any obstacles they might be experiencing. Because the better the relationship that you have, in my opinion, the better relationship that you have with the dev team, the easier your role becomes. And so, in building those relationships, it was always what's on your mind and what else, and just doing these biweekly check-ins. Have you done check-ins at all with your teams as a PM?
Yeah, we're going through our check-in process right now, actually. And I've been slightly procrastinating on writing check-ins. But something that I think is super helpful, I'm reading Measure What Matters by John Doerr. And in that, he breaks down why continuous check-ins are more important than annual performance reviews. And I think that that's really critical information because it's not as fear-based and like it allows people the opportunity to improve and like it brings things up when they happen. And I think that that's super helpful. However, something that I'm trying to be really intentional about is do that in a constructive way that helps people. And something that I learned recently is one, to structure your check-in feedback relative to someone's career development, so that like we mentioned multiple times at this point, it's like what is actually relevant, like what is really important here, and how am I not just like adding random information that isn't critical to this person's development. So it's thinking about, okay, for your career development you need the following things. I'm going to give you feedback on those things and what I've noticed, and in terms of strengths and weaknesses, areas for improvement, all of that. So that piece of advice was super helpful, so that I'm not just talking about random stuff that isn't relevant to that person's development as an employee. And then second, the structure of the feedback. So the way that my coworkers have put it is, maybe this is more common elsewhere, and this is my first time hearing it, is BIO. So bio is the structure of the feedback. So you talk about B being the behavior, right? And then I being the instances, and then O being the outcome. So saying like, John talks over me in every meeting. So at that point, you're talking about this person talks over you. You're saying that it happens every meeting. And then the outcome is, if this continues, then my trust in John during meetings will degrade and it'll make it harder for us to communicate. So I think it's really important to like not just give in feedback, but talk about why this is important in terms of its outcome for the team, outcome for that person, outcome for yourself as well, so that you're not just like randomly spouting out information in a way that isn't constructive.
No, that makes total sense. Um, so where can people find you? How can people connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn all the time. My friends kind of make fun of me because I'm on LinkedIn probably a little too much, but I'm definitely on LinkedIn and happy to connect there. Always producing content about several things: product management, the job search, imposter syndrome being the main topics, and then also diversity and inclusion. And I prefer that to be the main channel of contact. People have found me on other platforms, but that is not my preference, and I hate email. So good luck trying to reach me that way. Um, but yeah, I'm definitely all over LinkedIn. And then, as you had mentioned, Clubhouse as well. I'm trying to get more active there in terms of being in product rooms and product conversations.
That's awesome. Yeah, you have a ton of phenomenal feedback on all the channels that I follow you. So everyone, please go follow and connect with Phyllis. Phyllis, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would definitely be interested to hear people's feedback to this episode, because I'm relatively new to the field of PM, but also like PM is so different across different companies and different industries. So I'd love to hear where people found the message resonated, where people completely disagreed, because I think we're all always learning, and I'm not here to speak as some kind of guru, but just sharing my experience and opinion, and happy to learn about others as well.
Yeah, I love it. Well, have a good night. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.